The child's scream echoed through the sterile corridors of the Imperial transport, sharp and piercing against the cold hum of machinery. A scientist in a pristine uniform barely flinched, marking something on a datapad before stepping closer to the containment pod. Inside, a small human girl thrashed against the restraints, her eyes wide with terror, her breath fogging the glass. She's responding well to the neural recalibration, the scientist noted, voice clinical. Higher cognitive resistance than expected, but nothing we can't adjust. Behind him, an Imperial officer observed impassively. He was a man bred for war, his posture rigid, his hands clasped behind his back as he studied the rows of pods lining the chamber. Each held a human child, some sedated, others awake, their eyes hollow with confusion. The officer exhaled slowly. These creatures adapt quickly, he mused, and yet they break just the same. The scientist nodded. A few more cycles, and they'll be primed for integration. Neither man noticed the faint red light blinking on the security panel near the entrance. Neither saw the shift in the ventilation ducts overhead. But something unseen had already entered their fortress. Far from the sterile walls of the Empire's ship, in a vacuum of space where silence reigned absolute, another ship drifted like a ghost, a small, blackened vessel designed for one purpose. It clung to the Imperial cruiser's hull, invisible to sensors, its pilot already inside. Sarah Cade moved like a shadow, her breath controlled, her pulse steady. A single knife rested in her glove grip, its edge dark with the blood of the last guard she'd encountered. She barely acknowledged the body slumped behind her, the kill as natural as breathing. The Empire had taken her daughter. Now, she would take everything from them. Step by step, she advanced through the corridors, her body merging with the dim lighting. Surveillance systems were neutralized before they even registered movement. She passed through checkpoints where guards should have been stationed, silent now, their throats opened with surgical precision. Every action was calculated, every moment driving her toward the one objective that mattered. Lena, the name burned behind her ribs, fueling each movement. She found the main data terminal tucked behind layers of security. A lone technician sat at the console, unaware of the specter behind him until it was too late. Sarah's knife slid under his chin, her voice a whisper in his ear. "Where are the children?" He trembled, fingers hovering over the keys. I don't." She pressed the blade deeper. "Wrong answer." His breath hitched. The scent of fear filled the room. Then, with a trembling hand, he typed in the access code. Sarah watched as the screen flickered to life, blueprints of the ship unfolding before her. She found the detention level. "I've done what you asked," the technician stammered. "Please, A sharp twist, a gurgled breath. His body slumped over the console. Sarah moved. The hallways ahead were busier, guards stationed at critical points. The Empire believed itself untouchable within its own walls. That mistake had already cost them. She extinguished them one by one, cutting through their ranks with silent, practiced efficiency. A blade to the spine, a suppressed shot to the skull. By the time she reached the detention block, the ship had already begun to bleed. She accessed the control panel, overriding the locks. The reinforced doors slid open, revealing rows of cells. Inside, small figures stirred, some recoiling in fear, others barely conscious from sedation. Then she saw her. Lena sat curled in the corner of her cell, her once bright eyes dull with exhaustion. Sarah's breath caught. The girl's gaze flickered up, slow, uncertain. Recognition dawned, but something else lurked beneath it, hesitation. Sarah stepped inside, kneeling. "Lena," she whispered, reaching out. The girl didn't move at first. Then, after a heartbeat, she surged forward, burying her face against Sarah's chest. Small hands clutched desperately at fabric. Sarah closed her eyes for the briefest moment, pressing a hand against the back of Lena's head. "You came," the girl whispered, voice hoarse. "I told you I would," Sarah murmured. A sudden noise. Boots against metal. Sarah lifted her head, sharp and alert. The Empire had finally noticed its prey had been disturbed. The alarm blared through the corridors, a shrill, pulsing wail that sent the ship into a state of lockdown. Red emergency lights flickered to life, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. The Empire had finally realized something was wrong. Sarah hoisted Lena onto her hip, her daughter's thin arms wrapping instinctively around her neck. The girl was lighter than she should have been. They'd been starving her. That alone sealed their fate. Boots pounded against metal. Orders barked through comms. Security forces were converging on the detention block, sealing exits, cutting off escape routes. The hunt had begun. Sarah moved. A guard rounded the corner, rifle raised. He barely had time to register the figure rushing toward him before her knife was in his throat. He staggered, hands clawing at the wound, gurgling something incoherent as he sank to the floor. Sarah didn't break stride. More were coming. She felt it in the shift of the air, in the synchronized rhythm of movement. Their training made them predictable. She reached the main corridor just as the first squad arrived, a 6-man unit sweeping in with precision. Lena clung to her, pressing her face against her shoulder. She felt the child's breath hitch, but there was no time for comfort. Sarah pulled the dead guard's sidearm from his holster, raising it in a fluid motion. 1 shot, 2 shots, both silenced, both hitting home. The first guard dropped with a hole in his visor. The second spun, clutching his knee, a sharp cry of pain cutting through the chaos. The others opened fire. Sarah pivoted, darting for cover as streaks of plasma scorched the walls where she had just been. She moved fast, keeping low, calculating angles. A vent shaft 2 meters to her right. It was small, barely large enough, but she'd made impossible fits before. She sprinted. A guard lunged at her, swinging a rifle like a club. She twisted under the blow, using his own momentum against him. A sharp elbow to the throat, a sweep of the leg, and he was down. She put a bullet in his temple before he could recover. No hesitation, no wasted movement. Lena gasped as Sarah dove toward the vent, twisting her body to slide inside. Plasma fire rained against the metal exterior as she yanked the grate shut behind her. The heat singed her arm, but pain was secondary. The passage was tight, forcing her to move on her elbows. Lena pressed firmly against her chest. The girl was silent, trusting, though her fingers clutched the fabric of Sarah's suit like a lifeline. Through the thin walls of the shaft, she heard the guards regrouping. Where did she go? Check the perimeter. She won't get far. Command wants her alive. The child, too. Sarah almost smiled. They always say that. She pushed forward, muscles burning. Every second counted. The vent system branched in multiple directions, but she had memorized the layout from the stolen schematics. Left led to an armory. Right led to maintenance access. Straight ahead, her destination, communications. They had severed external transmissions when the breach was detected, but she could override it. She needed a ship. More importantly, she needed to make sure the Empire never used this place again. Minutes passed before she reached her exit point. She pressed a hand against Lena's back, a silent signal to stay still. Then, bracing herself against the vent walls, she kicked. The grate exploded outward. Sarah dropped, landing in a crouch. Gun raised before her feet even touched the floor. The comms room was small, lined with terminals humming softly with restricted data. A lone technician spun in his chair, eyes wide. He reached for an emergency switch. A bullet stopped him. Sarah placed Lena down gently. "Stay close," she murmured. The girl nodded. Sarah moved swiftly to the controls, fingers dancing over the interface. Layers of encryption resisted her, but she had cracked Imperial systems before. It was only a matter of time. Outside, voices grew louder. "They'll be here soon," Lena whispered. Sarah's lips pressed into a thin line. "I know." The final firewall collapsed. She accessed the ship's hangar bay, scanning for a viable escape. A transport ship, large enough, armed enough. That would do. She activated its remote sequence, fueling its engines, preparing for departure. But she wasn't finished. Her eyes flicked to the station's internal systems. Power grids, atmosphere regulators, self-destruct protocols. The Empire's arrogance was their greatest weakness, They never considered sabotage from within. She found the command. Her thumb hovered over the final sequence. Then, a new voice crackled through the comms. Sarah Cade. She froze. The voice was deep, measured, laced with amusement. The kind of voice that belonged to a man who had never known fear. "You've caused quite the mess," he continued. "And yet, you're still here." Lena's fingers curled into Sarah's sleeve. The girl knew, as Sarah did, that this was no ordinary officer. "You should feel honored," the man said. "I don't usually take personal interest in lowborn insurgents. But you're something else, aren't you?" Sarah didn't respond. Words were a waste of time. "I know what you're trying to do," he went on. "Blow my station, steal my prisoners, make some grand statement. But you won't succeed." A pause. "You see, we've already started our own hunt." Sarah's blood chilled. The security feeds flickered, displaying multiple locations across the ship. Soldiers storming through hallways. More disturbingly, children being rounded up, herded like cattle toward the docking bays. "They belong to us now," the man said, almost gently. "Including your daughter." Sarah's hand clenched into a fist. Lena pressed closer. "Mom." Sarah exhaled slowly. She had been prepared for resistance, but this changed things. The Empire wasn't just securing the station. They were moving the children, cutting off any chance of saving them all. She adjusted course. New objective. The transport could wait. First, she had to finish this hunt. The ship shuddered under the weight of battle. Distant explosions rattled through the walls, the echoes of destruction reverberating through the metallic corridors. The Empire had committed its full force now, locking down exits, sealing bulkheads, deploying their most lethal enforcers. Sarah could feel the shift. This was no longer a containment effort. They were hunting her. She welcomed it. Lena clung tightly to her back as Sarah moved. Her small fingers curled into the straps of her mother's gear. The child's breathing was quick, shallow, but she didn't cry. Not anymore. Sarah had taught her better. The commandant's voice still echoed in her mind, smooth and condescending, promising that the children were lost, promising that he had already won. He was wrong. Sarah adjusted her grip on the stolen rifle, its weight solid and familiar in her hands. The ammunition counter blinked. 17 rounds left. Enough. Ahead, the corridor split. Left toward the transport hangar, right toward the detention level where the Empire was corralling the remaining children. The mission had changed. Sarah took the right. The hallway was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that came before slaughter. She slowed her pace, scanning the dimly lit path. No security turrets, no obvious traps. That wasn't a comfort. It meant they were waiting for her. A vent hissed. The lights flickered. Then they struck. Black-armored enforcers dropped from hidden compartments in the ceiling, moving with mechanical precision. Enhanced. Faster than standard soldiers, stronger. The first lunged, a vibroblade flashing toward Sarah's throat. She twisted, sidestepping with a fraction of a second to spare. The blade sliced air where her head had been. Before the enforcer could recover, she jammed the barrel of her rifle under his chin and pulled the trigger. A muffled blast. His body hit the floor, lifeless. The others didn't hesitate. They surged forward in perfect synchrony, weapons raised, firing disciplined bursts of plasma. Sarah spun, grabbing the corpse, using it as a shield as she returned fire. 2 more went down, but they were adapting. One rushed her low, knocking her back. Lena yelped, gripping tighter as Sarah twisted, slamming an elbow into her attacker's visor. He staggered, but not enough. His fingers locked around her arm, crushing. She dropped the rifle, shifted, snatched the knife from her belt, and drove it under his ribs, twisting deep. His grip loosened, and something hit her. Hard. Pain exploded through her side as she crashed against the bulkhead, the force knocking the air from her lungs. Her vision blurred for a half-second, just long enough for another enforcer to aim his rifle at her skull. Then a gunshot. Not hers. The enforcer jerked. A new hole burned through his forehead. Sarah turned sharply. Lena sat crouched behind the body of a fallen soldier, a smoking sidearm clutched in her tiny hands. Their eyes met. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Sarah nodded just once. Good shot. Lena's hands shook, but she swallowed hard and stood. There would be time for softness later. Footsteps thundered down the corridor. More were coming. Sarah grabbed her rifle, reloading as she sprinted forward, Lena keeping close to her heels. The detention level was near. The air grew thick with the scent of scorched metal, of ozone and blood. She turned the final corner and stopped. A wall of bodies. Dozens of children, herded into a containment area, watched over by a single man. He stood tall, armored but elegant, his uniform untouched by the chaos around him. His hands were clasped behind his back, as if this were nothing more than an inspection. His face, pale, sharp, eyes like polished steel, bore no fear. High Warden Kairos. Sarah had seen his type before. A man who had never tasted desperation, never felt what it was to be prey. She raised her rifle. He smirked. Then the doors slammed shut between them. A reinforced barrier, thick as a ship's hull, separating her from the children. From Lena. Sarah turned sharply. Lena was inside. Kairos hadn't even looked at her, hadn't acknowledged the girl standing among the prisoners. The realization was immediate. He didn't know. Lena wasn't registered. They hadn't finished processing her yet. To Kairos, she was just another nameless captive. Sarah's jaw tightened. She pressed a hand to the door panel, already scanning for override commands. A voice crackled through the overhead speakers. "You're persistent," Kairos mused. "That's rare." Sarah didn't respond. She typed faster. "I assume you think this is some great victory," he continued. "That you've won because you made it this far. Because you killed a few men. But this station is an arm of the Empire. You cannot kill an idea." The console rejected her commands. Locked out. Kairos sighed. "You could have been something more, you know. Humans like you, so much wasted potential. Your kind could serve, could become greater than the scraps you cling to. Instead, you throw your life away for what? This." Sarah glanced up at the security camera. She wanted him to see her face when she spoke. "You took my daughter." For the first time, Kairos faltered. A brief hesitation, a flicker of calculation behind his eyes. Then amusement returned. "Ah, that explains your particular rage." Sarah reached in her belt pouch, pulling a small cylindrical device free. A miniature pulse grenade, low yield. Just enough to short out electronics. Kairos tilted his head. "What exactly do you think that will?" She threw it. The explosion rocked the room, a concussive wave that sent sparks flying from every console. The lights above flickered wildly, the door panels flashing red. Kairos' smirk vanished. The doors groaned, their locking mechanisms compromised. The security barrier lurched, then it slid open. Sarah moved instantly. The children scattered, a wave of terrified motion. Kairos stepped back, drawing a sidearm, but he was too slow. Sarah was on him before he could raise it, slamming his arm aside, driving a knee into his ribs. He grunted, staggering, but recovered quickly, too quickly. Enhanced like the others. He struck fast. A brutal backhand caught Sarah across the jaw, sending her reeling. Stars exploded behind her eyes. She barely had time to recover before he closed the distance, a blade flashing toward her ribs. She twisted, barely avoiding the strike. The edge grazed her armor, slicing fabric. She countered, striking hard, an open palm to his throat. He choked, stumbling back. A gunshot. Lena again. The shot hit Kairos in the shoulder, staggering him. He turned, furious, raising his weapon toward the girl. Sarah snapped his wrist. The gun clattered to the floor. She grabbed his collar, spinning him toward the nearest wall, and slammed his head against it. Once, twice. The third time, he went limp. Breathing hard, Sarah stepped back. Blood trailed down the bulkhead. Kairos slumped to the floor, dead. The room was silent. The children stared, wide-eyed, caught between terror and awe. Sarah turned, found Lena, and this time when she knelt, she pulled the girl close. "It's over," Lena whispered. Sarah exhaled. "Not yet." She stood, turning to the others. Dozens of children, lost and afraid, waiting for orders. She would give them one. "Move," she commanded. "Now." And they ran. The ship was coming apart. Explosions rippled through the station. tearing through corridors, rupturing bulkheads, and plunging entire sections into the void. Smoke choked the air, mingling with the scent of burning metal and scorched flesh. The walls trembled under the pressure of the station's impending collapse. Sarah ran. Lena clung to her hand, small fingers wrapped tight, her breath coming in short gasps. The other children followed, their footsteps an uneven chorus of fear and desperation. They were weak, malnourished, some barely able to keep pace. But they ran because she told them to. Another explosion. A section of the corridor caved in behind them, fire and debris consuming the path they had just crossed. No turning back. Sarah guided them through the chaos, her mind working in overdrive. She had memorized the layout, traced every possible exit before stepping foot on this station. The secondary hangar was close, but time was running out. The Empire would rather let this place burn than allow her to escape with its stolen prisoners. She reached a junction, stopping short. Ahead, Imperial troopers. A full squad, their white armor streaked with soot and blood, weapons raised. Behind, fire, wreckage, death. The children gasped, stumbling to a halt. Some whimpered. Some prayed. Sarah didn't hesitate. She moved. The first trooper fired, a split second too slow. Sarah was already ducking, already closing the distance, already striking. Her knife slipped between armor plates, carving deep, turning the man's cry into a wet gurgle. The others reacted, firing in bursts. She twisted, dragging the body with her, using it as a shield. Plasma bolts struck armor instead of flesh. Lena dropped low, pulling another child to the ground as a shot whizzed overhead. Sarah let the body fall and surged forward. A rifle came up. She knocked it aside. A blade flashed toward her. She sidestepped, countered, felt the crunch of a shattered visor as her elbow drove into a trooper's face. Two left. The first made the mistake of hesitating. Sarah shot him in the throat. The last one turned to run. She put a bullet in his back. The silence that followed was broken only by the heavy breathing of the children. Sarah scanned the fallen bodies. Ammunition, gear, anything useful there? A plasma charge. Small but powerful. She grabbed it, stuffing it into her belt before motioning to the others. Keep moving. They obeyed. The hangar was close now, the air thick with fuel and desperation. Through the open doors, she saw it. The stolen transport she had activated earlier, engines primed, ramp lowered. A path to freedom. And standing between them and it, a final wall of Imperial soldiers. Sarah knew immediately. She wouldn't win this fight in open combat. Not with the children behind her, not with her ammo running dry. But she didn't need to win. She just needed time. She pulled the plasma charge from her belt, armed it, tossed it. The explosion ripped through the hangar, throwing bodies, shattering steel, and sending a shockwave of heat rolling outward. The blast cleared a path, narrow, fleeting, but enough. Go, she barked. The children sprinted for the transport, fear overridden by sheer survival instinct. Lena ran beside them, but her gaze kept flicking back. Sarah was still moving, still fighting. A surviving trooper lunged at her, knife in hand. She parried, twisted, snapped his wrist. His scream barely lasted a second before she silenced it. More were coming. She reached the ramp as the ship roared to life. The first wave of children scrambled inside, some tripping, others pulling each other up. Then a new sound. Orders barked through a command channel, the hiss of an incoming signal. A voice Sarah recognized. Shut down that ship. Kairos was alive. She turned sharply. Across the hangar, through the smoke and chaos, he stood. Blood stained his uniform, one arm hanging at an odd angle. His face was twisted in fury, his gaze locked onto hers. He lifted a communicator, sealed the bay doors. The hangar doors, still open, still offering a path to the void, shuddered. Warning sirens blared as reinforced blast shields began to descend, threatening to trap them inside. Sarah bolted. She leapt onto the ramp, grabbing Lena and pulling her into the ship just as the pilot, one of the older captives who had managed to take control, hit the thrusters. The ship lurched, engines roaring, gears shrieking as the massive blast doors try to lock them in. Sarah reached the controls. She didn't hesitate. Manual override. Emergency propulsion. Full burn. The ship screamed forward. Metal shrieked against metal as they forced their way through the narrowing gap, sparks flying, alarms howling. Then, they were free. The station erupted behind them. A chain reaction, one explosion feeding the next, consuming the Empire's monstrosity in a firestorm. Sarah exhaled, sinking back. The children huddled together, silent, processing. Lena pressed close, her small hand gripping Sarah's wrist. "Are we safe?" she whispered. Sarah looked at her daughter, then at the stars stretching endlessly before them. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe the answer. Yes,